Hello, my History 157 students, Professor Donald Earl Collins. Just want to comment very briefly about your primary source analysis assignment and grading of it. For the most part, despite some confusion, I'd say about a third of you had some confusion about the nature of the assignment because they provided all these worksheets for you to fill out and all these other things that you had to do. But for the most part, most of y'all stuck to finding two primary sources. Most of you did 100, 250 words or more of analysis of each for each source. So that's at least 500 total words. Each of you filled out the appropriate worksheets for each of those two sources so that you could get a proper grade. And so as a result of that, you had good grades. But there are people who were confused. And to be honest with you, this was a sort of a cookie cutter assignment that the history program has put into a lot of the courses within the history program, particularly survey level courses, without really spending a lot of time going over what is a primary source, what's a secondary source, what's your tertiary source, those sorts of things. So that three or four of you either found your primary source through a secondary source or mixed up the difference between a primary source, secondary source, and even tertiary source. So I took some points off, but you didn't lose your grade because you followed the spirit of what you were supposed to do, even if you got the details of what is a primary source, what's a secondary source incorrect. Right? So for in that sense, all of you, for folks who did the assignment the way, more or less the way they were supposed to do, and even if there were some minor errors, you got 100. For those of you who um, either one source or both sources were not primary sources, but there were secondary sources or even a tertiary source in one case. Your grade stayed in A, but it went from being a perfect score of 100 to somewhere between the 90 and the 95, right? So there are a few of those. And then there are folks who haven't turned in this assignment. This assignment's worth 1/10 of your grade, right? If you want an A in this course, you need to turn this assignment in as soon as possible. So please get that done, right? Just get it in. Get it done and get it in and get it right, as right as you can. There's one other person I think who didn't do the essay part of this assignment, just filled out the forms, and they filled out multiple forms. And actually, there were about two or three of you who did more than two sources, even though the assignment specifically only called for two sources, primary sources, because although all those worksheets were there, just because they're all there and available for the kind of source that you might come across, doesn't mean you were supposed to fill them all out. You only needed two sources, right? They're there so that try to cover the variety of sources you might come up with, right? A cartoon here, a speech there, a letter to, your great grandfather here, that kind of stuff, right? A recorded speech there. So that's why the variety of sheets, we assumed it would be self-explanatory, but I guess not. But the bottom line is that if you don't do the analysis portion, that's basically write a 250 word or more piece, essentially analyzing the primary source that you've recovered, why it's a primary source, how useful it is to your particular topic, why this is significant, those kinds of things, then you know you've only done about half the assignment. And so if you want to get that part in, please get that in as soon as possible, as well. But for the most part, I just graded it as I saw fit based on the reality that, this assignment's somewhat confusing. You're in a survey level course learning about something that you really would only be doing if you were a history major. And while this might be somewhat practical from a understanding what plagiarism is and isn't sort of standpoint, it's really not practical unless you plan on doing primary research as a historian at some point. Then this becomes useful, but we have courses for that. So I took that into account in issuing the grades that I issued. If you have any questions, just email me. Otherwise, I think this is mostly a closed matter.